Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Ethan Katz, and I teach in the History Department and the Center for Jewish Studies at UC Berkeley. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to this installment in Berkeley Conversations. Today's event is entitled Race and Responsibility, and it is a conversation on Black-Jewish relations and the fight for equal justice. Before I introduce our speakers, I'm delighted to turn things over to the Chancellor of UC Berkeley, Carol Christ, who will offer some opening remarks.
Thank you, Ethan. And thank you to everyone who's joining us today for this timely and essential conversation about contemporary Black-Jewish relations. I'm particularly pleased that this event is part of our Berkeley Conversations program, a series we launched when in-person gathering on campus came to a halt, even as the need and demand for expert perspectives on complicated societal issues increased. As we all know, the pandemic has, among other things, highlighted and amplified racial and socioeconomic disparities in our country. Then last May, we were all shocked and deeply shaken by the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020. Here at UC Berkeley, we've responded with robust, renewed efforts to provide academic support to the movement for racial justice, even as we launch new programs to address all forms of inequity, exclusion, and discrimination on our own campus and far beyond. Today's conversation will touch on many issues that are part of that wider effort. The event arises in part from Berkeley's Antisemitism Education Initiative, an effort overseen by the Chancellor's Committee on Jewish Life and Campus Climate. I'm also grateful for the involvement of other sponsors and supporters, including the Othering and Belonging Institute, the Center for Jewish Studies, the Department of African American Studies, the Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies, and Berkeley Hillel. In fact, the full list of sponsors includes 11 different on and off campus institutes and organizations, a remarkable and welcome sign of constructive bridge building and collaboration between partners across and beyond our campus. I want to thank in particular the three Berkeley faculty members who made this possible, Professors Ethan Katz, Karen Barkey, and Tina Sachs. At Berkeley, we're proud to take the lead when it comes to engaging complicated, salient issues, including the historical and contemporary relationships between the Black and Jewish communities. We're fortunate to have these three distinguished panelists with us today and grateful that you could join us. Now let me turn this back over to Professor Katz so we can get this conversation started.
Thank you so much, Chancellor Christ, for those remarks and for your critically important leadership on these issues. Before I get to the conversation itself, I need to deal with a few important matters. This is meant to be an inclusive conversation, and that means that while the speakers will take questions from the moderator and speak to each other for the first 45 minutes or so, there will be ample time after that for audience questions. There are two places where you can submit those questions. On the Berkeley page where you clicked on the live stream, right below the live stream, there's a link to submit questions to the panel. If you enter questions there, I will see them. Or if you're watching the Facebook live stream, you can also submit questions directly there on Facebook. Please submit your question in the form of a question rather than a comment, and please keep them concise. I cannot promise to get to every question, but we will do our best. Feel free to submit them now or throughout the event. I also need to say some important thank yous. First, my partner in envisioning and planning this event at every stage has been my friend, Professor Karen Barkey. Without Karen's hard work, collaboration, and crucial input, this event would never have come together or taken shape the way that it has. Professor Tina Sachs has also played a valuable role in preparing and imagining this event. And we are grateful to Chancellor Christ for not only her presence here today, but for the important support of her and her office in planning and elevating this event. As the Chancellor alluded to, the event is the product of a remarkable collaboration that has brought together not only the units that she mentioned, but many more, both on campus and in the wider local community. Our sponsors today include at UC Berkeley, the Center for Jewish Studies, the Department of African American Studies, the College of Letters and Science, the Othering and Belonging Institute, the Helen Diller Institute of Jewish Law and Israel Studies, the Department of History, the Center for Toleration, Democracy, and Religion, and the Center for the Study of Religion. We're also pleased to partner with the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, Berkeley Hillel, Hamakom the Place, and Graduate Theological Union. Our heartfelt thanks to all of these co-sponsors and equally to the staff of all these units and institutions who worked tirelessly to assist us with the planning and promotion of this event. We hope that this will be the beginning of many new and fruitful partnerships in the years to come. I believe that this diverse cross-section of co-sponsors reflects the moment we are living in and the increased recognition of the need to come together to fight many forms of hatred and exclusion. Our most recent Berkeley conversation focused on the long history and current resurgence of anti-Asian racism. We have been reminded in recent weeks, and again in the past 24 hours, that racism in America is all too often a matter of life and death. As many of you are surely aware, on Sunday in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, a suburb of Minneapolis, Daunte Wright, a 20-year-old unarmed Black man, was shot and killed by a police officer during a traffic stop. In such a moment, conversations like today's feel both urgent and inadequate. We are faced with the challenging imperative that our discussions must become the springboard for concrete action and palpable change. Today's conversation looks together at two forms of discrimination: anti-Black racism and antisemitism, their similarities, differences, and interrelationships. Our topic also includes another challenging subject: relations between African Americans and Jews. These two groups have each suffered painful histories of persecution and violence, and yet their respective paths in America have not been parallel. In the larger racial reckoning we are in the midst of as a country, Black-Jewish relations has reemerged as a significant subject of debate. We are lucky to have three distinguished panelists here to discuss these complex issues, and now I'd like to introduce them. Eric K. Ward is a nationally recognized expert on the relationship between authoritarian movements, hate violence, and preserving inclusive democracy. He brings over 30 years of leadership in community organizing and philanthropy to his roles as Western State Center's executive director and senior fellow with the Southern Poverty Law Center and Race Forward. Since Eric took the helm in 2017, Western State Center has become a national hub for innovative responses to white nationalism, antisemitism, and structural inequality. In his long civil rights career, Eric has worked with community groups, government and business leaders, human rights advocates, and philanthropy. The recipient of the Peabody Facebook Futures Media Award, Eric is in high demand as a speaker and media source. He's the author of multiple written works credited with key narrative shifts, including the widely cited essay, Skin in the Game: How Antisemitism Animates White Nationalism. In conversation with Eric today is Professor Michael Rothberg. Michael is the 1939 Society Samuel Getz Chair in Holocaust Studies and Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Los Angeles. His latest book is The Implicated Subject: Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, published by Stanford University Press in 2020. His previous book is the seminal and immensely influential text, Multidirectional Memory: Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization. His numerous earlier publications include Traumatic Realism: The Demands of Holocaust Representation, and a co-edited book called The Holocaust: Theoretical Readings. With Yasmin Yildiz, he is currently completing the book Inheritance Trouble: Migrant Archives of Holocaust Remembrance, under contract with Fordham University Press. The moderator of today's conversation is Tina Sachs, associate professor in the School of Social Welfare at UC Berkeley. Tina's fields of interest include racial inequities in health, social determinants of health, and poverty and inequality. Her current work investigates the persistence of racial and gender discrimination in healthcare settings among racial or ethnic minorities who are not poor. She's the author of a book on this subject entitled Invisible Visits: Black Middle-Class Women in the American Healthcare System, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Her next major project explores the impact of the infamous US Public Health Service Tuskegee syphilis study on the study's direct descendants. Tina has written powerfully about the way that her Black and Jewish roots shaped her sensitivity to systems of discrimination and violence. And now I'm going to turn the mic over to Tina so we can really get the conversation started.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I am really excited to be here, and I'm just incredibly honored to be part of this conversation. I wanted to start out just by telling you all a little bit about myself to situate myself in this conversation, and then to kick us off. So as Professor Katz mentioned, I am a scholar of racial inequity, particularly race and gender discrimination in healthcare settings. I am not per se a scholar of Black-Jewish relations, of African-American history or Jewish history. However, I do come to this conversation as a person who thinks a lot about race and gender and how that matters in the United States. And I also firmly believe that particularly race is a fundamental organizing structure of US society. And given that, it has been something that I have been incredibly compelled by my entire life, particularly growing up as the granddaughter of sharecroppers who came to Chicago, who fled the violence and exploitation of the Jim Crow South and came to Chicago in search of a better life, free from violence and discrimination. And I am also the granddaughter of, I also come from a Bubby and Zadie who fled Ukraine and a shtetl outside of Minsk, who fled pogroms and came to the United States also in search of a better life free from violence and discrimination. And so my lived experience and my ancestors' experience tells me that that discrimination is a durable part of human life, human history, and has been with us for a long time and will undoubtedly be here after I am long gone. But I have been incredibly interested by the intersection, by the commonality, as well as the great dissimilarity between the experiences of my ancestors. And so I come to this from the perspective of a Black person who is also Jewish, and as the granddaughter of my Bubby, Zadie, and JB, and Grandma Lucille. And so I wanted to share that with you all just to give a sense of who I am and how I come to this conversation. And I am honored to moderate. And so I will be beginning with the questions. So just as I have shared a little bit about myself, I would like to ask both of our esteemed panelists to share a little bit about themselves. So Michael and Eric, although the settings in which you work are quite different, Eric being an activist and thought leader, and Michael being an academic and thought leader, each of you have made exceptional contributions to the way we think about allyship, anti-racism, and anti-Semitism. And I wonder if you could each briefly tell the audience how you came to your life's work and what proverbial roads did you travel to arrive at this talk this evening? And Eric, let's start with you.
I'm going to unmute there, Tina, so everyone can hear me. It's such a pleasure to be here with everyone tonight. You know, it's interesting to think about a road and a journey. You know, for me, my journey starts long before I'm born, right? And it starts when my family eventually relocates from outside of Louisville, Kentucky, to Southern California. And I grew up, I think what's significant about my life is, you know, I grew up in a moment where Southern California was in the midst of desegregation. And it was a pretty defining time. And desegregation of the public schools, what that meant for me in middle school, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, so junior high school in Southern California, was being given a city bus pass to ride the bus across town, almost an hour, where I then had to walk several blocks to school. And it was an all-white school, primarily, that was being desegregated in working class white neighborhood. So I would get off the bus in 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, and I'd still have to walk to school. And walking to school meant people driving by in their cars and shouting out things like "Go back to Africa" or calling me monkey or ape. These weren't other students, by the way. These were adults shouting these things at a young 7th grader. Wasn't alone in that. That happened to many Black and Latino and Asian students who were also being bused to school. And it happened so much that we never thought about actually telling our parents. One, we were in 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, and let's be clear, in junior high school, the last thing you want to be is noticed, right? And or to stand out. The second is that it just happened that much. It was normalized. It was for us quickly what it meant to go to and from school every day. And I remember in ninth grade, waiting out in front of the bus stop with some friends, pickup truck comes by, some men in the pickup truck shout out something to us. One of my friends yells something back and I think throws a rock at the pickup truck. I remember the screeching of the truck, and I remember the brake lights coming on. I remember folks piling out and running at us. And I remember in that moment, Tina, just deciding that I wasn't going to run, and I was tired of running. And I'm not going to go on or try to romanticize what happened. I think everyone who's hearing this story knows exactly what happens. I think they know that story didn't end up well. But it is the day that I decided to stop running from bigotry. And it's a day that I decided that I thought no one should have to live in fear. Not me, not my friends, not my family, and not my community. That happened at a time when punk rock and hip hop were emerging in Southern California. Remember, we are kids. We are trying to find a common identity. It's certainly not going to be along lines of race and ethnicity in Southern California in the late 70s, early 80s. So it became music. And many of us forged new identities that allowed us to build relationships with one another. That music scene was quite volatile, and it soon came under attack by white power punks, and eventually what became neo-Nazi skinheads who attempted to disrupt that scene, that music scene, to take it over. And it was a point where many of us had to decide, would we stand up for that music scene? That's what many of us did along the West Coast. But we realized that this wasn't just a subcultural problem, that there was something happening in America. And that happening was taking root on the West Coast. There were bombings, there were murders, there were beatings, armored car robberies, violent protests. That may sound like DC in January 6th, but that was the West Coast of the United States in the 80s and 90s. And it is ultimately what led me to this work. Ultimately, we found that the way forward was not through building new subcultures and silos, but building broad-based movements. And we built coalitions where you would find blue-haired Mohawk punk rockers sitting next to Republican farmers. We may not have had much in common. We didn't agree on very much, but we knew that organized bigotry could not abide in our communities, that we needed to respond to it so that we could address the real issues that were impacting our communities each and every day. We did that through music. We did that through political organizing. We did it through advocacy, research, and education. And many of those tools and the lessons that I've learned are being applied by others and myself around the country right now as we face a similar threat at scale.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I would like to pose the same question to Michael. So how did you arrive here tonight?
Yeah, thanks, Tina, and thank you and Ethan and everyone else who made this event possible. I'm really glad to be here and to share the screen with Eric and to listen to his really, I think, very inspirational story there, and really important story. I don't have a particularly dramatic story to tell. I mean, I think I'm here primarily because of the scholarly contributions that I hope I can make to this conversation. But I think that there were factors that were both intellectual and personal that were that were key to helping me develop the ideas that I've had. And if those intellectual and personal factors have something in common, I think it's perhaps a sort of critical sensibility that for me at least comes out of being part of a minority religion and culture as a Jewish American. And that has made me skeptical of all forms of common sense and orthodoxy, if I could, in a general way, including Jewish ones at times. And I think that kind of critical sensibility has been important to the kind of work I do. On the intellectual side, a key moment for me was really graduate school when I was working on a dissertation on the representation of the Holocaust in literature and art. And I had what I thought were these sort of parallel interests in African-American literature and post-colonial studies. And I always thought of them as separate things, you know, Holocaust over here, African-American culture, post-colonial studies over here. And then I discovered a book called The Black Atlantic by Paul Gilroy, which was a really important book for bringing a kind of diasporic framework, especially to the study of Black cultures. But also in the last chapter of his book, he sort of made gestures toward the commonalities between Black and Jewish cultures around questions of memory and violence and trauma. And for me, reading that book was incredibly liberating because I realized that, wait a second, these interests of mine that seem so separate are in fact intertwined with each other and entangled with each other. And it took me a little while to sort of start to put that into practice. But pretty much everything I've done since then has been dedicated to thinking about the way apparently different histories and cultures are in fact often very closely intertwined, not identical, but intertwined and entangled. There's also a personal side, which goes back to a similar moment. There I was in my early 20s, and really starting to think about what my relationship as a white Jewish American was to the founding crimes of this country, slavery and the genocide of indigenous people. And as someone whose family immigrated to this country in the early 20th century. So we weren't around in the 19th century. We weren't around when slavery wasn't taking place. We certainly weren't around when the continent was being settled and conquered, really. And yet, it still seemed to me pretty clear that I had certain kinds of responsibilities in relationship to those histories. And that despite the traumas of Jewish history, I couldn't simply identify with the suffering of African Americans or indigenous peoples in this hemisphere, especially as someone who grew up in relatively comfortable middle-class circumstances. I had to really think about what kind of responsibility I bore and even what kinds of complicities I was involved with in those other histories of violence. So I think for me, what I would say, I guess, is that the intellectual side and the personal side converge precisely around these key questions of violence, memory, and historical responsibility. But they converge in such a way that there are always tensions and contradictions that we have to acknowledge and confront. It's not an easy relationship, but one that we have to work through continuously.
Well, thank you both so much for that and for sharing some of your personal journey, because I think it helps the audience and helps us think about how particularly through the Zoom platform that can be so impersonal, but just to understand how your personal experiences really informed your intellectual and personal, your professional careers. So thank you so much for that. So turning to you, Eric, I'd like to ask you about a piece of work that you have completed that's one of your, I think, most well-known pieces called Skin in the Game. So in this piece, this essay that you've written, Skin in the Game, you note that anti-Semitism forms the theoretical core of white nationalism. Can you first describe your understanding of anti-Semitism, particularly vis-a-vis these movements that you were involved in the activist circles that you were involved in, and the movements that you were working against? And second, can you outline for us what you see as the relationship between Jewish people being characterized as white? So obviously in the United States, we know that around the world, race is a construction. Whiteness has a certain currency, right? It is a socio-political construction that everyone, whether or not they necessarily perceive themselves to be white, if others perceive you to be white, you have that sort of currency and power. So can you talk about the relationship between Jewish people being characterized as white nationalism, and anti-Black racism. And if you can say a little bit about how all of this is related to the present moment that we're enduring or that we are experiencing in the United States. And if you need me to recap, I will, because I am an academic, so I ask all these multi-pronged questions.
Yeah. No, this is I think a really important question. Look, the way that I'll just cut through it, the way to understand it is anti-Semitism is killing us. And I say that as a person who is not Jewish, and I don't say that in hyperbole. I say it in this way. We lost dozens of people who were killed in a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, who were Latinos. And they were targeted because they were Latino. We lost Sikh community in Wisconsin who were worshiping, who were killed in a mass murder because of anti-Muslim bigotry. We lost African-American worshipers in a church in Charleston, South Carolina, because of anti-Black racism. And we lost Jews who were worshiping in a synagogue, Tree of Life in Pittsburgh. That's some of the lives of the hundreds of lives that have been taken by white nationalist violence over the last 10 years in the United States. And those lives are precious, and they are gone from us. And while certainly anti-Black racism, and as I said, Latino and anti-immigrant xenophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry, right, and hatred towards Jews, none of us should forget that in each of those cases, the killers, while driven by that individualized bigotry, believed, right, that they were in an existential war with the Jewish community, and that the victims were merely puppets of their Jewish puppeteers. We have to understand that anti-Semitism isn't just at the core of white nationalism. I believe it is the core of white nationalism, and it is so central to white nationalism that I don't believe that we as Black people will be able, or other marginalized groups, quite frankly, will be able to win equity, right, in this society without also struggling to uproot anti-Semitism. When I came to the Pacific Northwest in 1988, 2 years after I moved here, we experienced the murder of an Ethiopian student by the name of Mulugeta Sarah. He was on his way home from school one night. He was attacked by a group of neo-Nazi members who beat him to death on the streets of Portland, Oregon. Yes, they attacked him because he was African-American, but those people believed that they were soldiers in a war to preserve the white race. This language that we hear each and every day, white lives matter, white genocide, right? Replacement theory. Let's be clear that those are just pop culture terminology, right? For the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. The idea that there is a global Jewish conspiracy, right, to usurp and destroy white Christians. It is a false narrative that has been dominant, not just in this country, but internationally since the early 1900s, made popular in Europe during the Dreyfus Affair in the early 1900s, and then spread by Russian Tsarist secret police, picked up by Henry Ford, a rich automobile industrialist, who republishes it under a series of essays called The International Jew, exposing hundreds of Americans. All to say, we should understand, right, that anti-Semitism doesn't come out of a vacuum. Hate groups don't come to our communities bringing anti-Semitism with them. They simply organize the bigotry that already exists. Amongst 21st century white nationalists, and I distinguish from white supremacy, this system of exploitation. When we're talking about white nationalism, We're talking about a social movement, and we shouldn't confuse the two. Certainly, white nationalism grows out of white supremacy, a system of exploitation built off of chattel slavery, the genocide and stolen resources of indigenous people, and the control of sexuality, primarily the control of women. But white nationalism doesn't seek to take us back to that day of past. It seeks to overthrow the United States. It sees white supremacy as a failed system that should be replaced by an all-white ethno-state free of people of color. In that vision, white nationalists cast Jews in the same role they have always played for anti-Semites, as the absolute other, demons stirring a pot of lesser evils and the driving force behind white dispossession. In short, Tina, at the foundation of the modern day movement of white nationalism is an explicit claim that Jews are a separate race, right? Not a religious other, but a racial other. Their ostensible position as white, right? White nationalist frame is the greatest trick that the devil has ever played. Jews, indeed, and despite because of the fact that they are primarily seen as white in the US society, are positioned by white nationalists as an enemy race that must be exposed and eliminated. And it is that fantasy of invisible Jewish power that explains how Black Americans, in the eyes of white nationalists, right, a race of supposed inferiors, could orchestrate the end of Jim Crow, how the LGBTQ community and feminists could upend traditional gender roles, and how immigrant workers today could mount successful challenges towards income inequality. Folks ask me each and every day, where is the anti-Semitism in the white nationalist movement? It's everywhere. When the Tree of Life shooter said Jews were committing a genocide against white people, he was using language that was intimately familiar to his fellow white nationalists. It is that type of rabid anti-Semitism that is the framework upon which the entire movement functions. Look, I started attending far-right and white nationalist meetings, right, in the early 90s, right? For years, I communicated, circulated, and spent time with the white nationalist movement. We documented, we collected their propaganda. In the flyers, yes, I'm not saying racism doesn't exist. I'm not saying homophobia doesn't exist. I'm not saying Islamophobia doesn't exist. What I'm saying is in all of those flyers, no matter how racist there was always some symbol or caricature, right? Anti-Semitic caricatures of Jews. For the white nationalist movement, they hold Jews in a different position as puppets of a master conspiracy. They see themselves at war with the Jewish community. And without tackling anti-Semitism, we don't remove a critical part of the oxygen, right, in combating the white nationalist movement and its narrative. Let's be clear. The white nationalist movement isn't winning because it's the smartest organizing factions in our country or because they have better resources. They're winning because they have a narrative that isn't being challenged, nor is anyone competing against it. And the second is we keep conflating white nationalism with the system of white supremacy. So we confuse the tools needed to respond. Conflating white nationalism and white supremacy is akin to conflating a cow and a Big Mac because they're both made out of beef. But the truth is when you drop your Big Mac, you don't call a veterinarian. In the same way, we have to continue to tackle white supremacy, which was written upon the paper of race. But we have to begin to turn our attention to challenging this social movement called white nationalism that is built upon the paper of anti-Semitism. And how do you respond to something that is driven by a form of bigotry that you don't even understand? That's why anti-Semitism became important to so many of us.
Thank you so much for that, explication of how anti-Semitism figures into the current moment, into white nationalism, and particularly for differentiating what you see as differentiating white supremacy from white nationalism, right? I think that is a really critical intervention, especially for me. I'm really concerned about structural racism, how race is baked into the cake of social stratification in this country, right? There is no way to even think about the United States without thinking about anti-Blackness, colonialism, slavery, all of these things, and the ways in which anti-Blackness is structured into our everyday lives and is the fulcrum upon which I think other people of color are also discriminated against, sort of these poles between what we have characterized as whiteness relative to Blackness, right? And what you are saying is that certainly, those issues certainly can remain true, and white nationalism is a separate, is a sort of a distinct movement that rests upon or uses anti-Semitism as its fuel. And I think that is a really important intervention. So thank you for that discussion so much. And so I'd like to turn to you, Michael, and to your work. In your work, The Implicated Subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, complicates our ideas about who is a victim and who is a perpetrator. For example, you describe the aftermath of the murder of Trayvon Martin, in which people took up the hashtag I am Trayvon Martin. You also note that many others would sort of push back against this a bit, noting that they were not Trayvon Martin, presumably to make the point that white people do not live under the same sort of state-sanctioned violence like we have seen in Minneapolis recently and tonight. So to suggest that we are not living under the same conditions that lead to the conditions that killed Trayvon Martin. Can you say more about this, including how it made you think about culpability, implication, and responsibility? And can you also explain what you mean by the implicated subject? And how does this relate to the broader Jewish community?
Thanks, Tina. And thank you, Eric, also for that really helpful, clear distinction that you just made between white nationalism and white supremacy. And like Tina, I think what it made me think is, for the most part, what I'm focused on is really white supremacy, and it's not because I don't think white nationalism is also important, and I completely take your point about that, and I have interest in that as well. But I think what I'm trying to clarify is probably more the structure of white supremacy and structural racism. Now, the funny thing about it is that I do it sort of through my perspective as a scholar of the Holocaust, and coming from Holocaust studies, and in Holocaust studies, we have a trio of figures that we tend to talk about when we talk about genocide and histories of genocide: victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. And of course, it's impossible to think about any history of racialized violence, Holocaust or otherwise, without thinking about victims and perpetrators. They're always there. But I started at a certain moment to think about how such histories are also made possible by other figures who don't fit so clearly into those categories, rather sort of participate indirectly and enable racist violence without necessarily being categorizable as perpetrators. And this has something to do with that personal dimension that I mentioned earlier, thinking about my own position in relationship to racial violence and histories of race and racism in the United States. Thinking of myself not as a perpetrator, but somehow still being implicated in those things. So that led me to this notion of the implicated subject and what I call implication. And I think this is probably best understood as a substitute for the concept of the bystander. For me, the bystander is a weak term because it implies passivity and a complete lack of involvement. And what I'm interested in is the way that people are actually participating, even sometimes by what they don't do, right? And always entangled, even if indirectly and not from a position of leadership, in these kinds of histories of violence that interest us. So for me, implicated subjects are those who enable, who perpetuate, who benefit from, and in some sense inherit histories of injustice, including especially histories of racist violence, though not only those. And for me, this notion of implication works on two axes, and this is a little academic maybe, but I think it's useful. On the one hand, I talk about what I call historical or diachronic implication. That's how we're implicated in past injustices. So our relationship to slavery, our relationship to the Holocaust. etc. On the other hand, I also think about what I call contemporary or synchronic implication. That's how we're implicated in currently unfolding injustices. So think about sweatshop labor and more generally the relations of global capitalism, or climate change, I think is relevant here, and a lot of other things as well. And as you can hear with those examples, right, injustice, and as you know already, injustice is by no means a singular phenomena. It comes in many different forms. And so the next thing that is important to me is to note that we are not situated identically in relationship to all these different forms of injustice, right? We have, in fact, what I call complex relationships to different histories of injustice. So I have this category called complex implication, and that is I use it specifically for cases in which people have, on the one hand, ties to history of victimization, as let's say Jews connected to anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, but on the other hand, are implicated in histories of perpetration. Again, not as perpetrators necessarily, but as people who are enabling forms of violence. So as a white person in this country, I feel I'm implicated in the structures of white supremacy, even if I also have this history of suffering that I inherit as a Jewish person. And as Jews certainly do inherit long histories of persecution, and anti-Semitism continues to exist, both in that kind of structural sense that Eric just elucidated for us so powerfully, but also sometimes on personal levels as well. But in the US today, I think, especially for those of us who are white and Jewish, we are also very much implicated in structures of white supremacy. We benefit from that, even if we don't endorse them. And I think that's really important to note, and it's important for us to take responsibility for. But so how do you take responsibility for your implication in structural racism? And here I want to go to that example of the Trayvon Martin case that Tina mentioned. While I was working on my book, The Implicated Subject, I was inspired in that kind of conceptual sense by a social media activist project that emerged in the wake of Trayvon Martin's murder, and especially after the acquittal of George Zimmerman. And here I'm going to, if you'll excuse the slightly professorial gesture, I'm going to just share a few slides. I think it's interesting to see some of these images. And so this is obviously the moment when Black Lives Matter emerged, which I think is safe to say is probably the, if not one of the most important social movements of recent years. But I started to think also about, okay, how can people contribute to this, participate in a movement like this who themselves are not Black, right? How should we think about that? You'll remember that in the wake of George Zimmerman's acquittal, there was a very common move where people identified with Trayvon, right? The slogan, I am Trayvon Martin, we are Trayvon Martin, kind of proliferated at demonstrations, online, et cetera, et cetera. This is what I call the logic of identification, expressing solidarity through an identification. I am, we are Trayvon Martin. And this has what I would call an honorable historical political tradition. I think of other examples like May 68 in Paris, where Daniel Cohn-Bendit, a German Jewish, also French activist, was expelled from France, and people protested by declaring, we are all German Jews, or we are all Jews and Germans, as it says in this poster from that time. I also think of protests in Istanbul after the murder of the Armenian-Turkish journalist Hrant Dink, where people declared, we are all Hrant, we are all Armenian. So these are powerful logics, and I'm certainly not saying we should reject them entirely. I'm just trying to think through their implications, and I do think that there are limits to them. And you see that, for example, in a case like the Je suis Charlie motif that also circulated broadly after the terrible terrorist attacks in Paris. And I think we all wanted to declare ourselves in solidarity with the victims of those attacks. And yet some of us, I think many of us, actually felt a little bit uncomfortable about that identification with a publication that really traffics in a lot of racist caricature, even if satirical. And so you start to see the limits of that kind of identification, or closer to home, during the protests against the so-called Muslim ban during the Trump administration, there was, again, a powerful slogan that came out, we are all immigrants. Well, we're not all immigrants, right? And indigenous activists responded and said, wait a second, I'm not getting behind that slogan. And so they offered this alternative, right? No ban on stolen land, which I think then, was also very powerful. And I think especially for those of us who are not indigenous, when we use a slogan like that, part of what we're doing is we're recognizing our own implication, right? That we are living on stolen land, that we are implicated in a project of settler colonialism, right? So you start to see the limits of identification, and you saw that in the Trayvon Martin case as well. And so pretty quickly, there were a lot of critiques that emerged saying, wait a second, white people aren't necessarily Trayvon Martin, can't necessarily imagine themselves into that space. It doesn't mean we can't have empathy, doesn't mean we can't have sympathy, but the identification, this declaration that I am this person who was victimized by racist violence, people started to become uncomfortable with. And in that context, there was a project which really kind of caught my attention called We Are Not Trayvon Martin. And it was, again, a kind of social media campaign. It didn't last too long. I'm not making great claims for it, but it led me to think. And it led me to think about other forms of solidarity that didn't pass through identification, but rather what I call non-identification, right? We are not Trayvon Martin. It became an opportunity to tell more complicated stories about race, in which, for example, the white mother of a Black child could talk about her relation to racist violence, or a person of color who was not African-American could talk about his relationship to anti-Blackness, or a person who might have the ability to pass and is therefore situated differently than someone like Trayvon, or who has various experiences with privilege, like the person on the right side of the screen now, and articulates that in their statement. And so I don't want to, that's all I wanted to show. I guess my point here is just to think about, alternative logics of solidarity that are not based on taking the place of someone else's experience, but declaring an alliance with them based not on identification, but on a recognition of difference, and especially in my terms, a recognition of our own implication in the structures that led to that violence in the first place. So a kind of prompting for a sort of self-reflexivity that I think we all need, right, in faced with different kinds of histories of injustice, because we're all complexly situated in relationship to many of them. I'll stop there.
Yeah. I mean, Tina, I know you're probably, holding and digesting. I think this is right? So we have to hold something. I'm just to be frank with folks, right? If we as progressives, those who believe in human rights, racial justice activists, right? Leaders within marginalized and vulnerable communities, if we don't learn to grow some complexity and nuance, right, around this moment and break with our own orthodoxy, right, that's made up of nice quips and things we've honed for decades that don't mean anything in this moment. I think Michael is exactly right. Look, this is a complex moment. About 4 years ago, I was outside of an alt-right protest. There was and I tell this story because I think it links Michael's point, which is this, right? There's a young alt-right activist. He's getting harangued by a counter-protester with a camera who's outraged that this alt-right activist is here in Portland and in this protest. And he's shouting at this alt-right activist, demanding that this alt-right activist answer to his camera why he's here in Portland. Doesn't he know counter-protesters don't want him? Not even the mayor of Portland, Oregon wants him, blah, 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 blah. Why is he here? This alt-right activist responded and said, yeah, I've heard we're not wanted here, but Portland is a city with a shrinking Black population by both percentage and whole number. That's true, by the way. And it's not just Portland. He went on to say, so you can say you don't want us here, but you're doing something we could never get away with. You are disappearing the Black population of Portland, Oregon. In short, he was calling all of us hypocrites. And I say all of us, right? Because we have to also come to accept that white supremacy works on a spectrum. And that means none of us, regardless of our color, regardless of our historical backgrounds, are absolved from the reality of white supremacy. It doesn't mean I carry as much, perhaps, as a white male in the society, but it is ridiculous to act like I don't carry any. And none of us should do that, whether we're talking about race, gender, sexual orientation, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. And if we all grew up enough to just be able to admit that, it would shift the conversation on race and systemic inequality in credible ways. We spend so much time trying to figure out who is the racist, who is the homophobe, who is the transphobe, who is the anti-Semite, who is the Islamophobe, that we don't spend enough time focused on what is racism, what is anti-Semitism, and we lose our way. I say this because we are at a moment where we have to realize that the real threat of white nationalism, and look, if you don't believe white nationalism is a threat after January 6th, I'll admit there's nothing I can do to convince you otherwise. If you still think what happened on January 6th is an aberration, what I'm going to say next isn't going to really make sense. But if you're a person who is smart enough, and we were pretty smart to know what we saw on January 6th, we're all pretty smart enough to know, right, that it wasn't an aberration. But that wasn't the peak, right? That was a trial run of what we are going to witness from a social movement that has grown from the margins to the mainstream of American society. We are not the only social movement on the terrain of American politics. And it's not a theoretical question, right? I have alt-right activists who live 2 doors down from me, 5 blocks, hardcore neo-Nazis. For those of us who live in the West, right? This isn't an imaginative question. This is a reality around how we continue the work of justice in our society, right? With the threat of a social movement that seeks to use violence to overthrow it. And at the core of its violence is an idea that is at war with the Jews. I don't need anti-Semitism to look like anti-Black racism for it to be a threat. It doesn't function like anti-Black racism. That's not its purpose in our society. It's also not just a set of behaviors, right? We wouldn't treat racism as a set of behaviors because it's also a system. Anti-Semitism is not just a set of behaviors, it is also a system. It serves and functions as a role as it always has since its inception. And part of its role was to racialize Jews, right? To turn them into a racialized other so they could be used as a buffer between the haves and the have-nots in the society. And because all of us are vulnerable to anti-Semitism, we have incorporated, right, those ideas that when the Jewish community does something, that we automatically attach something nefarious, right, to its actions, even if it is the same thing that any other group, right, ethnic, religious, cultural group might do in the United States. That's the power of anti-Semitism. I say this again because it's time for us to understand we almost lost democracy on January 6th, right? We were at a moment where it was not clear that our democracy could withstand the pressure and the attacks that it has faced, right, since the victories of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. The white nationalist movement is a reaction to the victories that were made through the sacrifices largely of Black people and their allies in the South in the 1960s. It is not my job, right, to turn my back on those sacrifices. It is my job to steward those sacrifices and those victories so that we can build on them. And it doesn't happen without taking on white nationalism as a social movement. And we don't take on white nationalism without taking on anti-Semitism, right? And the day that anti-Semitism in America looks like anti-Black racism, I will tell you this, the person who has spent years with the white nationalist movement, who researched them, who predicted their rise along with others. The day that anti-Semitism looks like anti-Black racism, I will tell you, we are all in trouble because we will have lost this country. Western State Center and my work works to advance racial and gender equity in the society. But we understand that as communities push and expand real democracy, inclusive democracy, that is people-centered, transparent, and accountable, it is the system of democracy that protects and sustains those wins. Democracy doesn't guarantee racial and gender equity. Let's be clear. As an African American, I can attest to it. But we don't hold on to gender and racial equity without democracy, real democracy, as a vehicle. And we have become way too cynical. We have allowed people to make us too cynical about the importance of democracy in our society. Black folks died for the democracy that exists in this society. What democracy exists because of those sacrifices and the sacrifices of others, Jewish allies, Native folks, Muslims, immigrants, poor whites, women, gays, and lesbians. They laid down their lives for this democracy. And that democracy has provided a better society for all of us, despite the horrors that we still deal with each and every day. I can sit here and say that what we face as Black people in this society is completely intolerable, and we shouldn't tolerate it anymore. And I can still acknowledge that life for me in 2021 America is better than my family in 1921 America, and certainly better than life in 1821. And if it's better in 2021 America, it's because of my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and those they joined with, and the sacrifices that they made around this country, and the blood that they shed willingly and unwillingly to get us to this point. So we need to get serious. This isn't either or around racism and anti-Semitism. It is understanding that if we don't lean into these issues, if we don't lean into one another, we don't figure out how to support the Black Jews in our environment, right? We are all in serious trouble. I don't know how to underscore that anymore. If you don't believe what you have witnessed over the last 4 years, there's nothing Michael and I are going to say tonight that's going to convince you otherwise. But if you believe it, lean into these questions, debate anti-Semitism, understand you have to fight both white nationalism and white supremacy. You need to build the tools to do both.
Eric, thank you so much for that. And I just wanted to, I mean, you have really said quite a bit there. There's a lot to digest. And I just wanted to, put forth a couple of ideas here. One is that certainly that I think some of the issues that you raised around the centrality of anti-Semitism in what's occurring right now in the rise of white nationalism is really, really important. And I think also to go back to what we had previously discussed about the difference between white nationalism and white supremacy and about structural racism, right? And so one of the things I think that critical race scholars typically, would argue is that anti-Blackness is really at the core of the American story and the removal of Indigenous people, right? The sort of the erasure of Indigenous people to claim the land, to form this white settler colonial society, as well as to capitalize off of the bodies of African descended people. That exploitation really allowed this country to be the greatest economic power in the world. And so those things are undoubtedly, it is just simply a complicated question. And so when you were speaking there about nuance, I think it is also important to say that certainly that people can harbor individual prejudices. There is no question about that. But I do think that in many ways the United States functions as it was intended. And so that the root of the othering I think is very important to put that in the context of also of racial capitalism, right? That we have a system of social stratification that is based on race that is essentially used to extract labor and to stratify, to extract resources, labor, land, all kinds of things from people. And so that is really important. And so if you think about that in the context of the way that typically that Jewish people are thought about or sort of have been racialized as white, I think that complicates the matter just a bit. And what I'm getting there, what I mean to say is that given what I study and what I really, I think, are some of, in addition to white nationalism, some of the critical questions that we're grappling with in this country are just sort of, how are we going to deal with the criminal legal system that we have? How are we going to deal with the way that racialized bodies are treated in the streets? And in addition to that, how are we going to manage the crux of white nationalism, which you so eloquently have argued is really anti-Semitism? So I just want to try to hold both of these ideas up here. So thank you for just bearing with me there a little bit.
I love it. I love it. I think about it because it's a binary. White supremacy is a binary, right? And it's hard to understand that in that the real world does not function like a binary, despite white supremacy's attempt. And so systems are very complicated, right? When you look at you look in the Bay Area, right? There was a study done in the Oakland School District, I think back in, I don't know, I'm going to say like 2012, 2013, 2014. So look at teachers in the public school system and their interaction with Black male students. And what they found out, right, unsurprisingly, was that implicit bias played out in terms of white teachers' interactions with Black males, right? That there was measurable anti-Blackness that was implicit, meaning unconscious, right, for the most part. But here's the trick, right? When they did the study of Black teachers, Black educators, they found the same thing, not at the same level, right? But it still existed. It doesn't make people bad, right? That's a system that socializes and provides permission for different types of behaviors, right? It's not a neutral system, right? It's a system that either provides incentives, right, or punishment for specific types of behavior. And all of us are awarded in the United States, regardless of our race, religion, gender, economic status, all of us are rewarded for reinforcing white supremacist practice, right? That is how the society was socialized. So you're right, it's deeply complicated, but I think we have to be careful about the Jewish community and whiteness. I think it's a very complex issue, right? Jews are not always seen as white, and we have a fixation on it in a way that we don't fixate on other communities. Look, I can tell you for a fact, right? Light-skinned Arab Americans up until September 10th, right, 2001, were primarily seen as white in the society and were afforded some privilege, right? I can tell you, starting September 11th, 2001, that certainly wasn't the case. Why? Because whiteness is not a real, there's no biological definition of whiteness. It's a social construct. It's fluid. It shifts. That's why sometimes Swedes were not considered entirely white, right? The Irish were not considered fully white. Latinos in the Southwest, right, after the Mexican-American War, were for a brief moment considered white. Whiteness is a weird fluidity that we have to be careful being caught up in. Yes, there is privilege, right, in being seen as white. Light-skinned Black people who are perceived as white experience that when they are outside their communities. For me, I think the whiteness in the Jewish community is interesting because I actually call it, I think it's not a permanent whiteness, right? It's conditional. And there's always this underlying condition, i.e. anti-Semitism, that privilege will be taken away, right, and replaced with something incredibly punitive. And most white people don't have to walk through life, their communities don't have to walk through life wondering if their whiteness is going to get stripped from them. That tells me the way that Jewish community interacts with whiteness is somewhat different. And I think we can say that without taking away the fact that privilege functions in our society based off of skin color.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
think that's right.
Mm-hmm. So let me like shift gears just a little bit here. And this is a question for both of you, but let's start with Michael. So your work really delves into the complexity of time and memory, particularly vis-a-vis historical and contemporary dimensions of injustice. One thing that has always struck me as a person who is Black and Jewish is that at least in the United States, Black people are, I feel that we are always admonished to forget, to not look back, just keep moving. That was in the past. And why do we have to keep talking about this slavery thing all the time? Black people are admonished for even a passing reference to past injustices, while as Jewish people, we're often, the phrase never forget is a very, very important part of Jewish culture. And so, Michael, I was wondering if you could both historicize that for us and sort of talk about the meaning of that and how that has come to be. And then also to try to think about how memory plays into implication and responsibility.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, thanks. And I have things to say also about the conversation that Tina, you and Eric were just having, but maybe we'll come back to that later. Because I do think that while I agree with so much of what Eric is saying, and also what you were saying, Tina, I think there's also a kind of fundamental ambivalence to Jewishness in the present. That on the one hand, you have white nationalism and this really central role that anti-Semitism plays in it. On the other hand, you have a lot of Jews who are participating in very far-right politics. And this was especially obvious in the Trump era when you had people like Stephen Miller in the White House preparing and propagating racist, anti-immigrant policies. And if you also look more internationally, I think you see certain alliances between the right wing in Israel, and then right-wing populist governments in Europe, in Poland and Hungary. So I do think it's a complicated picture. And I think while what Eric says is really important to keep in mind, I think we also have to keep in mind the ambivalence of Jewishness at this moment, as well as those of us, the sort of whiteness of many Jews and how that feeds into some of these questions of structural racism. But let me get back to your question, Tina. And what it reminded me of a little bit was something I was just reading in James Baldwin as I was thinking about this event and preparing for this event and reading some of his great essays from the 60s about anti-Semitism and racism. And he says in one of them that, Jewish suffering is perceived as part of the moral history of the world, but Black suffering is not necessarily. And I think that's kind of what you're articulating there. I do have to say, though, while I recognize and entirely agree with the way you framed the question, it does have a historical dimension. As a scholar of Holocaust memory, I can say it wasn't always so. So, I think we tend to take for granted today that we're supposed to never forget the Holocaust. But if you look back into the earlier post-war period, you see, especially in the first, let's say, 15 years after the war, that wasn't at all the message. It wasn't the message in the US, it wasn't the message in Israel, and it wasn't the message in a lot of other places. Holocaust survivors were in fact told to sort of put the past behind them, and in fact to forget and not to never forget. So that memory of the Holocaust had to be constructed. It wasn't also, like race, it wasn't a natural thing that was there from the beginning. It has gone through its own history, and there have been various turning points. A really important turning point was 1961 and the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, which mobilized testimonies by Holocaust survivors for the first time in a public way. And that really changed the discourse. But there have been other moments like the late 70s. And this is an interesting moment for our discussion. The Holocaust miniseries was a really key moment in the emergence of a global Holocaust memory. It came the year after Roots was aired on television too. So you see, again, these histories are entangled. And then I would say, the early 90s is another important moment. At the end of the Cold War, the opening of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, the opening of Schindler's List, there was a kind of memory boom and a Holocaust memory boom. And so a lot of the way we think about memory, I think, today, and especially Holocaust memory, is shaped by that moment, or this recent moment of a kind of globalization of Holocaust memory, if you will. That said, I think what you say is still really important, Tina, and I agree with it. And I think there is an asymmetry in which Jews are expected to remember, and Black people, this is all very crude, but nevertheless, you see what we're talking about, are expected to forget. And I think it has to do with which memories a society thinks are disturbing or finds disturbing, and which ones it can comfortably integrate. And so I was thinking also about, say, the selective remembrance of a figure like Martin Luther King Jr., right? And so, everybody can remember his non-racialism, his nonviolence, this sort of thing, but who wants to remember his militant opposition to the Vietnam War or his calls for economic redistribution, especially late in his life? Those things tend to get filtered out because they're more disturbing to the status quo. And so I think that I think there are some memories that challenge injustices and some that make societies feel better about themselves. And I think that Black memories of suffering immediately connect to inequalities in the present. And that's what makes them, I think, hard for the mainstream to tolerate at times. While I think memories of Jewish suffering, at least in the US, are not particularly threatening, despite everything that Eric's been saying, which again, I think is really important. Despite the persistence of anti-Semitism, most American Jews are not suffering as Jews, even if anti-Semitism plays a key role, right? It's operating at a different level, I guess I would say. Mm-hmm. So I think that when we think about memory today, we have to not think about just what we should or should not remember, but how and why we remember. Seems to me what's really crucial. And I don't have a perfect answer for this, and certainly not an answer that would apply to everybody or a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. Ideally for me, and this is very much at the core of my work, memory can and should be the basis for solidarity, not just solidarities within groups, but solidarities across groups. That's what I think is really important for political mobilization and also for taking responsibility for the histories in which we live. At the same time, I realize that if you're in a structurally marginalized position and your memories are not being taken seriously, are not being incorporated into the public sphere and the public conversation, I think a first step is to assert those memories, to assert the memories of your own group. So I entirely understand that and value that. I think for Jews, at least as far as Holocaust memory goes, of course, we need to keep remembering the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. This is what I've dedicated part of my life to ensuring. But I think we need to think in new ways about what it will mean to keep Holocaust memory living and keep it, let's say, ethical and powerful. Mm-hmm. And I think it needs to be, I think all memories, not just Holocaust memory, all memories need to be constantly re-articulated with the conditions of the present, because memory is something that always happens in the present. Even if it's about the past, it's happening in the present. And for me, that means trying to think about new ways of articulating Holocaust memory in a responsible way that can still join it in a conversation with memories of other histories of oppression. It seems to me that if Holocaust memory is going to continue to be a meaningful thing in the 21st century, especially as generational change takes place, we need to preserve its specificity, but we also need to think about ways of putting it in conversation with other histories of oppression. And that's happening. And I think that's really important.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for that. Really interesting. And just thank you for historicizing that for us and giving us that context. It's really important. And I think, Eric, did you have anything briefly to contribute to that? Or
so I have so much, but I'm gonna hold because I bet we'll circle back. Okay. And but so much to add, and so appreciated the piece, and there's just a lot of nuance, and this tells us something. As much as we think anti-Semitism gets discussed, right? The fact that there's so much nuance that we could all tease out here, right? The fact that the construction of race is likely happens in Spain, right, around the Inquisition, right before the Discovery Age, and the first racialization, right, is anti-Blackness in Moors, right, and the racialization of Jews in Spain, right, which is and so white supremacy, right, at its origins was othering Black and Jewish folks, and it still does so today, right? It just, they don't look the same, so we often just don't think that they are the same thing. And in terms of memory, right, I think Michael is exactly right, right? Memory is about helping us understand and to walk the present. And we often hear this idea, look, no one wants to hear about Black history. People, look, you know, we've been talking Black Lives Matter for 5 years, and people are already exhausted talking about Black folks for just 5 years, right? And but we often hear, you know, anti-Semitism is discussed more, the Holocaust is discussed more, but that is also a recent phenomenon. And when we don't have a good historical understanding, we also don't have a good sense of the arcs. And if we don't have a good sense of the arcs, you're not very good at building strategy and tactics to counter this piece. So take Michael's class. That's what I'm going to say.
Thanks.
So let's move into we have about 45 minutes left, and I want to make sure we have time to get to the audience's questions. So I want to just sort of try to stitch together some of the commonalities and also get you all to think critically about the points of convergence and divergence among Black and Jewish people. So obviously, Black and Jewish people have long histories of persecution, victimization, and suffering, as well as adaptation, creativity, and resilience in the face of this victimization. Can you, and Michael, you've already beautifully sort of touched on this, but can you discuss the points of convergence and divergence in those histories? In other words, there are similarities and great differences between the histories as well as the present. In the treatment of African descended people compared to Jewish people in the United States, of course, always acknowledging that there are Jewish people of African descent, there are Jewish people of all backgrounds. But how does that play out now? And what are the possibilities for coalition? What are the tensions? So trying to think a little bit more about the relational aspect of this between these communities. And so maybe, Michael, if you wanted to start, and then we'll go to Eric.
Sure. Yeah, I can say a few words. I want to start, though, by saying that I'm not a historian, either of African Americans or of Jewish Americans, but I am interested, as I've been talking, as you've been hearing here, I am interested especially in memory. So I want to keep approaching this really from the perspective of a memory scholar. In my previous book, which is called Multidirectional Memory, I tried to develop a framework for thinking relationally about different memory traditions. And in particular, I was interested in precisely the ways that the memory of the Holocaust had, as I discovered in the course of working on this book, always been in dialogue with memories of slavery and colonialism and with anti-Black racism. And this relationship between, let's say, memory of the Holocaust and memory of slavery or African-American history more broadly is often portrayed as a very conflictual and competitive one. And of course, there is conflict and there is competition. But what I came to realize is that for as long as I was able to look back, starting really right after the war, right after the Holocaust, I was able to find a kind of counter tradition in which people were thinking in a productive and dynamic way, and were articulating memories in a productive and dynamic way, which brought these different histories into conversation and showed that when we remember, I think what we do is we actually produce more memory. We don't produce less memory. We don't marginalize other memories, but we actually make it possible to articulate an ever diverser, let's say, collection of different memories. And it's that kind of dynamic, dialogic relationship between memories that seem to come out of different traditions that I called multidirectional memory. And for me, the starting point for thinking about that, even before I had this term multidirectional memory, was when I discovered a short essay by the great African-American intellectual and activist W.E.B. Du Bois called The Negro and the Warsaw Ghetto. And it was an essay that he published in 1952 in what turned out to be a communist Jewish journal called Jewish Life, as I discovered. And it described a visit that he'd taken to Warsaw in 1949. And in 1949, Warsaw was still reduced to rubble as it had been by the Nazis during the war, and especially the site of the Nazi-built Jewish ghetto in Warsaw. It was basically essentially a field of rubble. And when Du Bois saw that, he writes in this short essay, it really changed the way he thought about race. He says that, as a Black person in the United States, I have my experience of racist violence, of the Klan, of Jim Crow. But he says, quote, nothing in my wildest imagination was equal to what I saw in Warsaw, right? It was such a devastating landscape of absolute destruction that he realized that something else had gone on here that he hadn't quite grappled with. Mm-hmm. But in recognizing that this was not equal to anything else that he'd seen, he did not sort of silo off those different histories of anti-Blackness and genocidal anti-Semitism. Rather, he came to, I think, a kind of relational understanding. And he wrote that what he came to realize was that the problem of slavery, emancipation, and caste in the United States was no longer, in my mind, a separate and unique thing. I find this so powerful. Not equal on the one hand, but not separate and unique on the other hand either, right? No, he says, the race problem that I was interested in cut across lines of color and physique and belief and status. I mean, I think this is very close in some ways to Eric's vision, sort of holistic vision as well. And I think this is, not everybody shares this carefully, ethically differentiated vision of the relationship between different forms of racism that Du Bois does, but he's not alone either, as I found in working on this book. And it wasn't just Black intellectuals who saw it either, it was also Jewish intellectuals. So someone like the Polish-French-Jewish writer André Schwarz-Bart, who survived the Holocaust, lost most of his family in the Holocaust, but then in 50s France discovered people from the Caribbean and felt this incredible kinship with West Indians because of their shared histories of trauma. And he talks specifically in this really beautiful essay that he wrote also in the late 60s, around the same time that Baldwin was writing, who I cited earlier, about the importance of the word slavery for him. And he wrote, he says, I believe that it was that Jewish child whose fathers were slaves under Pharaoh before becoming so again under Hitler, who was taken by a definitive fraternal love for the West Indians, right? So through the figure of slavery, he was able to bring together Jewish diaspora on the one hand, Black diaspora on the other hand. And so to me, these are really powerful articulations of relationality. But what's striking is that, of course, what both Schwarz-Bart and Du Bois are comparing are, on the one hand, Black experiences in the New World, right? Black experiences coming out of Atlantic slavery and Jewish experiences in Europe, right? The Jewish experience of the Holocaust in particular. And so when we kind of return to the United States, I think, as well as seeing those kinds of convergences, like around that notion of slavery that Schwarz-Bart uses, as well as those kinds of convergences and overlaps, I think we also have to be honest and say there's a real divergence between the experience of Black people in the United States and white Jewish people in the United States. And I've been thinking a lot about Ruth Wilson Gilmore's famous definition of racism, right? That gets cited a lot in critical race studies, right? The state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death, right, which describes so powerfully anti-Blackness and other forms of racism, but strikes me as not very applicable to American Jews today, or at least I don't quite see it that way. And so I don't think we're particularly vulnerable to premature death as Jewish people, maybe for other reasons. Even if, as Eric argues, anti-Semitism is so central to white nationalist ideology. And I'm not trying to downplay the importance of anti-Semitism here or to say that it's a completely different phenomena. I think they both fall under the category of racism. But I think looking at it from an American contemporary perspective, for me, the differences are really important to highlight, as well as those convergences, even if we need to think about those convergences as part of our political vision. So important to imagine solidarity across those lines.
Right. And perhaps, thank you so much for that really beautiful articulation of that and just how thoughtful that was. And I think, at least for me, sometimes I do think about the possibilities for coalition really must begin with an honest assessment of the similarities and the differences, right? Like that's where we have a chance for solidarity, I think. But I should let Eric respond to that question or respond to Michael's response.
Yeah, so I think it's important for us to understand a couple of things before we dive into Black Jewish relationships. It depends, right? It depends what wave of Jewish immigration are you talking about? What part of the country are you talking about, right? And what period of time? It is a fluid relationship, right? Is it a Black Jewish relationship as colleagues in the struggle for equity, right? Is it a Black Jewish relationship where Jews are an immigrant buffer to the Black community, and you witness the same tensions between Blacks and Jews that you might between Blacks and other newly arriving immigrant groups in urban areas because of anti-Black racism, because of xenophobia and structural inequality. All to say, I think it's hard to draw an overly broad brush around Black Jewish relationships. But I will say this, right? This is a society that is as fixated on Black Jewish relationships as it is Black crime, right? And it's fixated because it allows the society to do something, right? Let's be clear, right? The fixation on Black crime, which is no higher than white crime, and particularly when you do it around, when you reduce it to economic status, right? Those disparities all but disappear. And but what it does for the society is it allows the society to justify, right, the violence that it has already been using, right, to subjugate Black folks and women and others, right? It becomes a justification. And I often think the debate around, Black and Jewish relationships parallels a kind of similar place, right? It serves a purpose, meaning if we can point to Blacks and Jews arguing with each other and not getting along, and Jews calling Black folks anti-Semitic, and Black folks calling Jews racist, it actually lets the society off the hook, right? And you take two of the smallest demographic minorities in this country, and you situate a focus on them that allows the society to project, right, and avoid reckoning with systemic inequality. So that's really the place that it plays out. But look, there is a reality around Black and Jewish relationships that we have to understand. The myth of the Black Jewish relationship focuses primarily on the 1960s, early 1950s, 60s civil rights movement, and then projects that relationship, right, across the entire interaction of Black Jewish communities. It also is a question of what Jewish community might you be talking about? Are you talking about the Ashkenazi community that only arrives in significant numbers, right, starting in the late 1800s, but primarily in the early 1900s to the US? Are you talking more about the older, right, Jewish community, Sephardic, right, that came out of Spain? Folks who we might in some ways refer to as Jews of color, right, who were here in the US longer and actually had a little bit more of a conservative politic as it tried to navigate its own survival in American society. All to say, the Black Jewish relationship is whatever we decide the Black Jewish relationship is. And we as Black people, we as Jews, right, shouldn't be allowing other folks to define that relationship for us. But we don't get to define that relationship unless we do three things. The first thing is that we have to recognize, right, that there are different forms of bigotry and they function in different ways, right? Because I think, as Michael said quite succinctly, and I think also said earlier, right? If just because Jews don't suffer the physical impacts of racialized anti-Jewish hatred called antisemitism, doesn't mean that it's not a threat. And it doesn't mean that it's not a threat to non-Jews as well, right? If we are only going to calculate the importance of a form of bigotry by the physical impact that it has on our society, we are missing a ton of nuance, right? Bigotries aren't only used for physical social control, right? Forms of bigotry are used to transform societies in significant ways. And the deal is this, right? We don't untwine anti-Semitism without addressing racism. Why? Because anti-Semitism in America is a form of racism. And you can't fight that racism unless you're fighting racism. And the truth of the matter is we don't untwine anti-Black racism unless we confront anti-Semitism. Why? Because anti-Semitism is used each and every day to deny the humanity, to deny the legitimate grievances, right? And to deny the agency of Black folks, right? It gets used to say that we have no real legitimate grievances, that we're merely just having our strings pulled by this larger Jewish conspiracy. It denies us our humanity and it leaves us in danger. They are intertwined, as many have pointed out over time, and we have to take them seriously. But look, I want to be clear about something, right? We have to continue the work around structural inequality, right? In the same way, right? That one has to assure on a ship, right? That there is equity. But don't forget that the ship still has to float at the end of the day. There is no other ship here, right? And we have to stop being this idea that the struggle we are in right now is a 30-minute sitcom, right? Where we have a challenge and then it all gets tied up all nice. And that's how we know it was it all worked out because everyone is happy. That's not real life, right? And that's not how this is going to play out, right? How this is going to play out, right, is that we either take this moment seriously and understand we have to push for equity in our systems, and we have to figure out how to confront and marginalize this white nationalist movement, or we are going to find ourselves, right, without a system in order to advance racial equity. And look, to continue to bring this back into the non-theoretical, right? Been, right, out on out in the field, right, with these white nationalists in the 90s and 2000s. These are folks who are very serious about their violence, right? It's not a rhetorical question. It's not a threat, right? They mean what they say when they say that democracy that is not white rule is not worth having. And it is a social movement that has as much impact in our society as our own social movements. And so, look, Black-Jewish relationships are important because of this, because Black and Jewish relationships have allowed the advancement of civil rights in this country and a host of other issues, from living wages to healthcare to transportation and education. The truth is that civil rights movement of the 1950s and its legacy continues to deliver more for this country, right, than any other social movement has been able to do. And it does so universally. That is nothing that is nefarious, right? That is a way that a society continues to advance into a strong democracy. But we need to caretake that relationship. We don't caretake that relationship through mythology. We caretake that relationship by sitting down with one another and understanding that the struggle that unites us is the struggle against racism in the United States. And everything in this moment is secondary to that struggle towards racism. Why? Because racism isn't an economic equation. Remember, if there is racial capitalism in America, it is because white supremacy preceded it, right? It preceded capital and capitalism, right? And it means that at the end of the day, right, in the struggle against racism in this country is a struggle over governance. It is a struggle around who belongs, who is an American, and what will America look like. And until that equation gets settled, we don't settle the questions of climate or economy, because you have to be considered a fully human being to weigh in questions of economy, right? It's about governance, it's about who belongs. And right now, we need to build the framework and coalition that shows that all of us belong here in this society. It is our country, and it is what we will make of it.
Thank you, Eric, for that. And so since we are running out of time, I did have some more questions, but I want to turn to the audience questions, the ones that are, they seem to be coalescing here around several issues around Israel and Palestine, and how to think about these issues in the context of the United States, and about the solidarity issues that we have been discussing here. So there are several of them, and I will just choose one of them. And I think this one is a beautifully phrased question that I'm going to direct to you, Michael. How do you see your analysis applying to the Jewish American establishment as implicated entities rather than as bystanders in regard to Israeli support for settlements and or occupation action in the Palestinian territories? And then this question, of course, is complex, and there are other questions here as well about how we think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in terms of alliance building in the United States between Black Palestinian Jewish communities. So, sorry, Michael, to put that heavy, complicated question on your lap, but it was addressed to you.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's so much complicated as, well, of course, everything is complicated. Of course, it's complicated. It's also very loaded and politically sensitive, I suppose I would say. I mean, I guess the first thing I want to say is maybe not directly addressing the question, I'll get to that in a second, is that for me, it's kind of axiomatic that neither solidarity with Palestinians nor critiques of Israeli policy are by themselves anti-Semitic, right? Any political position can be articulated in an anti-Semitic way. There's no doubt about that, but I think it's really important to separate out anti-Zionism, critiques of Israel, and anti-Semitism. And I think part of the problem that we've been having conceptually and politically is that accusations of anti-Semitism are often being instrumentalized, or as we often say today, even weaponized against those who are in solidarity with Palestinians or against Palestinians themselves. And I think part of what has enabled that is that we have this working definition of anti-Semitism put forward by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which has been adopted by states and various organizations around the world, and is a very vague, unfortunately, and easily co-optable definition, which allows it to be used often, again, to delegitimate criticism of Israel. And so recently, a large number of scholars put forward a kind of alternative definition of anti-Semitism that attempts to disarticulate in its explanations again, criticism of Israel from things that are clearly anti-Semitic. I wasn't involved in writing this, but I was happy to sign on to it. And I'm one of hundreds of scholars, many of whom in Jewish studies, Holocaust studies, scholars of racism and anti-Semitism who signed this. And I think it's an important initiative because I think it offers a more precise definition and it does a better job of trying to separate out when does critique become a form of racism and when does it not, which I think is really important. I do think that despite all of the sensitivities, all of the contradictions, all of the difficulties that, of course, solidarity across the lines of Jews, Palestinians, and Blacks is possible and necessary. I think it's also to everyone's advantage. It's one of the things I like about Eric's vision is this very encompassing vision of liberation that says we all have something at stake, right, in overcoming injustice. And I think that's really important. I think that the difficulty for many Jews, I speak partly autobiographically and from my sense of the Jewish community in the US, is that the question of Palestine really strains our usual self-conception as being part of a minority and being part of a group that has a long tradition, both of suffering, but also of commitment to social justice. And in the case of Israel, I think we find ourselves aligned with a state that has been occupying land now for many decades, occupying the West Bank, right, and blockading Gaza now for many decades. And that puts us in a kind of uncomfortable position. It puts us in a position that we don't like to see ourselves in. And that kind of takes me back to my notion of complex implication, which I think is really at play, again, at least from the perspective of Jews, in the whole Israel-Palestine question. Because I think we do come to this history with memories of trauma, with memories of suffering, either very close to us in terms of family connections or broader as part of the Jewish community. And so we inherit memories of victimization. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And yet we're faced again with a situation which we're also implicated in a form of oppression against another people. I don't see another way to say that. And I think that's true, as the questioner asked, for certainly some of the major Jewish American organizations, though I think there are also some important counter forces that have emerged in recent years that I also really value. I'll say that I think our implication as Jewish Americans in what's happening in Israel-Palestine is not only as Jews, though, it's also as Americans. Because we are paying taxes like all other Americans, and those taxes are going in large numbers for military aid to Israel that's being used in ways that many of us probably would object to. And not only in Israel, this happens, of course, in other parts of the world as well. Mm-hmm. And here's a place where I think African Americans, though I really value the kinds of solidarity that have emerged in recent years between African Americans and Palestinians, for example, African Americans are also implicated by virtue of being Americans, right, in US foreign policy. Mm-hmm. And so again, I think there's room for self-reflexivity for all of us, and for recognizing both the complexities, but not using those complexities to excuse our implication or even complicity in the oppression of other groups.
Thank you so much for that. Wow, that was, yeah, there's so many deep things. This is a very deep conversation, so I'm just really trying to absorb all of this. So I'm going to go to, there also, as one would expect, some amazing questions here. So I wanted to try to field some of them. This question is, this is for Eric, and this is about sort of the idea of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and the relationship therein. So the question says for Eric, you seem to make the case, to be making the case that anti-Semitism is core to white nationalism in a way that Islamophobia is not, which seems to run counter to what's happening across the world and the US, where proposed anti-Islamic laws are proliferating. Can you explain your thinking or your rationale, which I think you have throughout, but if you could expound upon that.
I'd love to. Yeah, look, Islamophobia, it depends, right? In Europe, at least in the modern present day context, until most recently, Islamophobia was a religious form of bigotry. I'll let others speak. There are better experts than me on this topic, but I will argue, right, that Islamophobia became increasingly racialized. And what I mean, right, is in post 9/11, Muslims were seen less as a religious other than a racialized other. How do we know? Because we saw Sikhs being attacked, right, for being perceived to be Muslim. We saw Latinos being attacked, right? South Asian Hindus being attacked. That is because in the minds of the majority of the American public, right, when they hear Muslim, what they automatically visualize is skin color. So folks are right to understand that increasingly Islamophobia is a racialized form of bigotry, and it should be responded to in that way, particularly in the US context. Why is it different than anti-Semitism? Because when white supremacists, when those who believed in Jim Crow, right, and we can go back, right. This is not. We don't have to imagine this, right. I encourage folks within the context of academia, right. Don't go buy these books, right. Look at the writings of folks like William Pierce, David Duke, right, Tom Metzger, right, Richard Spencer, right, the intellectuals of the white nationalist movement. Look at their work. Let's don't guess what they say. Look at what they say. And what you will see, right, is I'm not placing Jews at the center of their conspiratorial worldview. They have already done so. I'm merely just recognizing how the movement talks about its own construction. And as Maya Angelou once said in writing, sometimes we got to believe what people tell us about themselves, right? We have become such an arrogant human rights movement where other movements who aren't grounded in inclusion like we are tell us who they are. And then we say that's not what they are, right? And it gets us in trouble. And it's what got us to January 6th, right? Wasn't just a failure of government, right? There's a lot of responsibility for government to hold. The truth is someday when we talk about repair, when we talk about reconciliation, the human rights movement and the civil rights movement in this country is going to have to answer the question, why did it too ignore the white nationalist movement for 3 decades? Not only ignore it, but downplay it, right? Not only downplay it, right? But to sometimes, right, push back against those who were trying to take it seriously. We have to understand that at the end of the day, the white nationalist movement responded to its loss to Black people in the South in the 1960s by saying they didn't lose to Blacks, that they lost to a Jewish conspiracy. That's why anti-Semitism sits at the core of white nationalism. Again, this isn't a hierarchy of oppression. I'm not here saying Muslims don't suffer from Islamophobia, that we as Black people don't suffer from anti-Blackness from the white nationalist movement. Trust me, we do. In fact, we may suffer from anti-Semitism more than the Jewish community does when it comes to the white nationalist movement. What I'm simply recognizing is how the white nationalist movement situated its narrative. And I'm just asking the rest of us to accept what they tell us about themselves.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to ask a question just that sort of tries to synthesize some of your thoughts, or allows you to synthesize your thoughts here, and then to have a chance just for a bit of conversation between the two of you, if time allows. So obviously, as we've talked about, this is a time of incredible dislocation, upheaval, the pandemic, the racial reckoning, the insurrection, voting rights, anti-Asian hate crimes, gun violence. All of these things are really bubbling up in this time. And so I'm wondering, given your personal humanity and your scholarship and your activism, if what would you say are the most important takeaways from each of your work? And what are our individual and collective responsibilities going forward?
I'm gonna let Michael get the last word on this one. Look, I want to thank everyone for being part of this conversation tonight and wrestling, right, with new concepts. We're building new muscles here. So if you have a headache, if you're like really frustrated, or if you're like, wow, I don't even, I think that's a good thing, and we need to feel that more around this conversation. What I want us to take away is this, right? Please keep fighting for racial equity in the society. Do not back down, right? Do not be afraid of the tension. And I'm not here to tell you that everyone's going to be nice about pushing forward, but we have to push forward, right? We have advanced this society to a place where democracy, right, is actually something worth fighting for in this country. So let's keep pushing and doing that work. And I want to thank everyone who has done that work. You've carried so much over the last year, over the last 4 or 5 years. I know people are exhausted. I know people are tired. I know people are frightened. But look, we can move mountains. We just have to believe that we can do it. Understand that the white nationalist movement is a reaction to our victories. It exists not because we are losing, but because we are winning. Don't let them steal this victory from you. Be disciplined. Second, let's take governance seriously. I'm tired and exhausted with the burning down, burn it all down mentality, right? We understand the rage at Western State Center. I understand the rage as a Black man, right? I get the rage, but you don't get to burn down what generations of Black people have built, right? And I got to tell you, right, that you have to take governance more seriously. We need students in college to start volunteering, right? There shouldn't be empty slots on the water utility board. There should be 20 people running for mayor of a city, right? We have to deal with the stewardship of what it means to manage a community. 3, let's reverse this trend of social movements and human rights movements being subculture and being purist. We need to be broad-based movements. Ultimately, we have delivered more for white people in this country, right, as we have struggled for our own rights and equity, than white nationalism ever has or ever will deliver. We need to be proud about that. And we need white folks to know, right, that they have a place in this 21st century civil rights movement. So I tell folks, roll up your sleeves, take this moment seriously. It's not often a generation gets the chance to make history, but yet here we are. Let's make it matter.
Thanks. That was, I think Eric should have had the last word, but I guess here I am, the scholar who's going to have the last word nonetheless. Hopefully Eric can say something else. I mean, I sign on to what Eric is saying. And I especially like that last point about being against purity or the purist movements. I mean, that's really important to my thinking as well, on a slightly different level, I'll admit, but that's partly what my project on Implication is about. It's trying to take politics out of a moralistic, purist place and recognize the way that we are often implicated in forms of oppression and not just in the position of the victim, let's say, and taking responsibility for that. And so I've definitely been thinking about all the issues that Tina mentioned in her question. And I will make one more plea and thinking about a couple of them very quickly for this category of implication as a kind of analytical category for helping us get clarity on what's going on, which I think is also, is really critical. So I've been thinking, for example, about that really vicious attack on the elderly Asian American woman in New York that was captured on video. And it's a brutal attack, and it was really difficult to watch that video, as I'm sure everyone would agree. And what struck me there was that, of course, on the one hand, yeah, you have to be pretty disturbed to perpetrate an act of violence like that. But at the same time, what really struck me was the more ordinary actions of the security guards, right, who stand and watch and close the door. This is what I mean by implicated subjects. They are not just bystanders, they are contributing to the scenario in which that kind of violence is possible and will be repeated again and again. They might not have been able to stop that particular act, but that radical lack of solidarity, that radical lack of humanity is part of what makes these forms of racist violence possible. And I think there's something similar to be said for gun violence more generally, which I think a lot of us have been thinking about recently. Obviously, these are cases where you have clear victims and you have perpetrators, people who are pulling the trigger. But how is gun violence possible at the scale that it is in our country? It's because of a lot of implicated subjects. It's a lot of people who are, in fact, complicit in making the conditions of possibility possible for that kind of violence. It's lobbyists, it's politicians, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I think you have to factor in not just the perpetrators, but those who are enabling the perpetrators at various levels. And then finally, I've been thinking about the pandemic and what that has revealed for us. different things, I suppose. But one of the things I think that's important for me, and it has both a positive and a negative side, I guess, is it shows just how entangled our lives are with each other, and that we have capacity, that we share a certain vulnerability as humans. I think that's true, and that's what a lot of people have been talking about in recent years, in the scholarly world at least. But we also share a capacity to endanger others, not necessarily on purpose, but simply by virtue of who we are. We are implicated in each other's lives. And so I think recognizing that kind of implication, our capacity to wound and endanger, has to also be the basis for recognizing our responsibility for others, again, for creating new forms of solidarity and care, and the kinds of political movements and governance of precisely the sort that Eric was just talking about there.
Wow, thank you both so much. I mean, I wish I had more time to synthesize and just talk through with you all of these amazing ideas. And I really thank you both for bringing your deep thinking and humanity to this. And I really like the idea, Michael, of just trying to think about these issues in human terms, right? The ways that we can heal and harm one another, and our responsibilities to one another in that way. And I think at a certain level, it simply comes down to that. So I hope we can hopefully take that and go forward. And my favorite quote from an activist, Mariam Kaba, is hope is a discipline. And so I hope that we can think that we can imagine a new world together. And I want to thank you all for that. And I want to turn it over to Professor Katz for the last word.
So thank you so much, Tina. I want to thank all of our panelists so much for this extraordinary conversation. Thank you to our two featured speakers, Eric Ward and Michael Rothberg, and to our moderator, Tina Sachs, for just a really stimulating, lively, and perhaps most importantly, brave conversation. And thanks to our audience for a lot of really important and penetrating questions. I'm sorry that there were many we did not get to. We often say we could keep talking for a long time. Rarely have I believed it as much as I do at the conclusion of this conversation, and we're hoping in various ways to continue these conversations. But we dug deep here, I think, into critical questions in ways that should leave us all thinking, learning, and wanting to reflect and to engage more. And I'm really grateful to all three of our panelists for all the thought that you put into the work that you do and the work that you did for this conversation. In the vein of greater exploration, I'm going to post a slide here for the next few minutes that just has a handful of resources, many of them related to the work of our panelists or our co-sponsors, and that are really helpful places to go to learn more, to find more conversations, to find opportunities for engaging actively with these issues. Those resources will stay up for a few minutes even after I sign off. And so I just want to close by thanking all of the staff at UC Berkeley who worked so hard to put on this program. Thank you again to the Chancellor and her office for all of your participation and support. And thank all of you in the audience for tuning in. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.